So I think Sarah and I are going to keep our remarks very short so that we can still interact with you here in the audience. We've had a lot of information to absorb. I just sort of have, I would think I'm going to serve, and we say in the academic community, as a discussant. So you've had a lot of information to absorb. You know, what do I think about that information instead of starting with sort of a new subject? And I think that when we look at these scenarios, and I think our opening presenters have done a good job sort of showing you the wedges of what one would conceptualize, you know, what contribution can come from renewables and what contribution can come from changing our car technology and so forth. I guess I would tell you from some of the work that I've done traveling around Silicon Valley and other places and looking at how people are looking at sustainability from a very different lens of this sort of infrastructure solutions, is to think about the fact that we're moving into an age where today 50% of the world's population live in cities. A lot of those cities are coastal, so we know that that's going to provide some challenges from a changing climate. We also know that by 2050, in the time frame of these forecasts, 80% of the population, according to the UN, is going to be urbanized and living in megacities. We can see today already some of those big megacities in China and India and other places in Africa. We're talking about cities of 30 to 50 million people. And if you think about cities to 30 to 50 million people, and we're all worried about what's going to happen with batteries and what's going to happen with electric cars, if you think about the worst day of traffic in Denver, which is, you know, a relatively small city, then you can imagine that in a city like Mumbai or Beijing, people are not going to be able to organize their lives around an automobile, and they're not going to be able to have personal automobiles. And if you then look out into the technology future and think about automation, you know, maybe none of us are going to be driving at all because whatever vehicles we're going to be using, they're going to be on demand, and they're not going to have a driver in them. And they're going to be organized around an algorithm, you know, kind of the way, think of like a combination between your Waze program and your current Uber system. So we're really going to be approaching things in a different way. Maybe cities are going to provide access to services in a way that doesn't require you to move from one part of a city to another. And so whenever I hear these scenarios for rapid decarbonization, I always feel very pessimistic. But I'm really a big believer in human ingenuity. And so I really do think that when we focus on these issues, we have to really think creatively. And I'll just finish with one last point. We're going to have to think creatively, and you can see this in this country, in the United States alone, because as we have more severe weather, the current infrastructure we have is, I mean, I lived in Northern California for 5 years, had to put my cards on the table, and then I lived 25 years before that in Houston. So I've been a major evacuee. But I think having had that experience of having to evacuate for different kinds of disasters, I think we can understand that as attached as we are to our current lifestyle and current infrastructure, we're going to actually need to adjust and be creative and come up with better solutions for mobility and for electricity and heat. Because some of the solutions we're currently using are not going to be maintainable in the kind of housing and urban settings that we're going to live in.
Good, all right. Well, thanks very much to Morgan and to everyone for hosting this discussion today. I am a big fan of scenarios. I use them a lot to sort of shape our thinking on the energy program that I run. But I'm going to depart from that just a little bit because I think that while I think all of the sort of thought-provoking things that were put on the table, both in the geopolitical scenarios and the energy decarbonization scenarios, are really helpful, I find we're in this like really unique period of time where there's enough change right now to make people's day-to-day sort of decisions about their strategic options today relative to the next 5 to 10 years daunting enough, and the next 20 to 30 to 40 years really, really hard to grapple with. And so I've spent a lot of time, I work in a think tank where I'm one of 30 programs, right? So I think about energy all the time, but the other people I work with think about a whole bunch of different dimensions about what's happening in the international landscape, and broadly this term geopolitics. And so what I find is there's so much churn right now in the geopolitical environment that it's really helpful for framing my thinking about what's happening in the energy sector if I start with sectors other than the energy sector, right? So for example, and I know this is an issue Amy thinks a lot about, but like in the sort of like big data tech side of things, like there's an open question in my mind as to whether or not the energy system is going to be fundamentally overhauled by the fact that energy will become almost free to be able to produce, and the infrastructure will be costly, and the information about what you use will have a value. Like that's another completely different scenario that we don't really think about, but it is certainly part of what my colleagues who are doing sort of the future of information technology and the fourth industrial revolution think about the potential for like really upending our energy system in a way that we're not thinking about. We think about integrating some of that stuff into our low carbon solutions, but there's a real chance that that could be sort of a big sort of game changer in the energy space. The other one is that, you know, fundamentally geopolitics right now are changing. And so we have Henry Kissinger is a board member at CSIS, and he's written a lot extensively about how the rise of China has given this period of time where countries are actively renegotiating their positions on the world stage, right? And this is a real politique kind of environment where actually energy gets pulled into that struggle as opposed to as the defining feature of that struggle. It can also be a defining feature of that struggle when you think about, you know, the race for decarbonization, but it can also just be like, how is China investing in a whole bunch of countries around the world, and are they winning over soft power influence, and what does the U.S. want to do about that, right? Or how are we thinking about in influencing sort of the future of geopolitics in Africa, and is the United States competing with other countries effectively to do that? So in my world, those are the kinds of things that people are thinking about on a geopolitical lens. To a deeper level, there's also this question about the late Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski was a board member at CSIS, and he wrote about the mass democratization of information and global awareness, right? So this idea that like people all over the world know much more about the world around them, and they have demands and they have thoughts about their futures, and we have to be able to incorporate that into democratic and non-democratic processes. Again, these are things that are not the energy sector, but they are geopolitics. And so I think when you take into consideration that really dynamic technological and geopolitical environment, and then you also overlay it with all the things happening in the energy sector, which are truly, truly transformative. It's just hard to transform a system as big as the energy system very quickly. It leads you to sort of having to figure out, you know, whether or not even our most imaginative scenarios are capable of having us figure out what we think this future might look like. And so I basically have the 3 C's of the energy transition that I tend to think will help me sort of like align defining features. And the first one is competition, right? So an environment where you have more technological choices and more resources is going to be one that is fundamentally more competitive. And I know we always thought that an energy scarcity framework was particularly competitive. I think an energy abundance and optionality framework is going to be way more competitive. And so when I talk with companies, even incumbent companies in the energy system, what they're concerned about is whether or not they're going to be able to compete. If you're in the oil and gas industry, you've got to go work to figure out who your customers are now in a way you just didn't have to before. And so I think that that's really important. The second one is consumers, right? Consumers, the consumer base has changed, and I think this is brought up in a lot of the scenarios. It's new people in new countries that are going to be the source of growth, and their trajectory for growth may not be the same one that we followed. And I don't just mean how energy intensive it'll be, but talk to a lot of countries around the world who want to follow the China model, right? The idea that you don't just want the lowest cost energy supply to fuel your growth, but you want it to help you build an industrial policy. You want it to help you do something that's different that will help you compete. And that's a different kind of consumer leverage that we don't really, think about. And then there's sort of like the consumer element, well, this is like the prosumer, which I think you're probably all more familiar with. And then the final one is crises. And I don't mean this in an alarm raising kind of way, but there's just a series of things for which we are not prepared to deal. The first is cybersecurity. If you look at sort of like the history of warfare, we're going to have a massive cybersecurity issue before we come up with like real rules that govern what's inbounds and out of bounds in terms of cybersecurity. So I anticipate there'll be some degree of cyber crises. As Amy just mentioned, I think there's going to be climate crises, right? So climate impacts, we are deeply unprepared to deal with those. We're too late to avoid them. And so we're going to have a lot of climate-related crises as well. And the third one I spent a lot of time thinking about is sanctions and trade-related ones. Even at today's level of sanctions and economic statecraft and warfare that we're seeing, we're already sort of, doing harm to this globally interconnected energy system that we talk about. And I think it's going to precipitate in a number of trade-related crises as well. So I don't know what the future is going to look like. I don't know what 2050 is going to look like, but I do have a sense that those three realms might be some of the themes that I'm going to use to think about geopolitics and the energy sector for the next couple decades. Thanks.
Thank you.